Hello, welcome once again to the turret of pleasure here in the enchanted kingdom of Hermione. Haven't made a lot of videos lately because I've been sort of building up to some kind of decent ones, and this hopefully will be one. I have been doing a lot of research. It's weird now that I'm officially retired, a ward of the state, as it were. I have found lots of time to do some reading, and I've been really interested in what I guess can only be described as the history of the record business. Now, the record business, quote unquote, is just about dead and gone. Um, Certainly, it bears almost no resemblance to the record business as it did during my formative years of the 60s and 70s. and the the sort of history of the record industry for me is really interesting because of all the different things that went on and how it happened simultaneously in different places and very differently in those different places and so on and so forth. And so to that end, any book I can find about the record industry, I'll buy. Now I buy bios about musicians anyways, avid reader of bios, and I am an avid reader of bios of movers and shakers in the music industry, the producers, the executives. And I also am really, of course, being a record collector, I'm really interested in just the nuts and bolts of the records themselves and the companies and, why the companies existed, what their mandates were, stuff like that. And there is, surprisingly, quite a lot of books about these things. And it just dawned on me a while back I should do a video on all of mine. Now, a lot of these I've had for years. Some of them are brand spanking new. And but these cover a lot of ground, and this I'm going to stick in this video because I think I'm going to have to make a few of these. But in this video, we're going to strictly discuss the books that I have that are about record labels, the histories of various record labels. And I figure I'll do it in order of big to little. So, big labels. The biggest label for a long time, once they got there, was Warner Brothers Records, or more accurately in the 70s and 80s, what was known as WEA. WEA stood for Warner Electra Atlantic, because by that point, those three labels had amalgamated, originally under a company called Kinney Incorporated, which was a weird company of funeral parlors and parking lots and maintenance companies and all kinds of really unsexy stuff. And they bought Warner 7 Arts, who had bought Atlantic, and then they bought Elektra, and they rolled them all together. And then lots of fun came out of that. They created things like Asylum came out of that, Casablanca came out of that, Frank Zappa's labels came out of that, etc. And so, but the big daddy of them all was Warner Brothers Records. And by about 80, I guess, or so, WEA was the big major label. They had more sales, they had more hits. They took over about then from CBS Columbia, who up to that point were the granddaddy. But I figure Warner's is bigger, so I picked this up. And Warren Zanes is, I forget what band he played with, but he played in a band. Look, here we are. Wait a second. Bill Fuegos. Thank you. And this is a coffee table book. If ever there, look at that. This is beautiful. So this is a pretty good book. Now, what I don't particularly like about it is it really takes the kind of company road here. There is nothing in here that tells you anything bad that Warner Brothers may have done or bad, stupid decisions. It's kind of all sweetness and light. It's a pretty good. Like I'm just going to take a quick jump in here. It's been a while since I've read this one. When Warner Brothers was started by Jack Warner, primarily to put out his movie soundtracks, which were then very lucrative. Um, they were fucking terrible. I mean, they were a fucking terrible, terrible label. And they kind of hobbled along for a couple of years. They hired Jim Conkling, who had quit from as being the head of Columbia Records. So this was a big come down for Jim, but he was on the West Coast, which is, I think, is what he wanted. And he had complete, and Warner Brothers hobbled along. They put out some, if you find old, like gold label Warner Brother records from about pre 1962, they're usually just garbage. Wow. But they had Cookie Lend Me Your Comb, which was a kind of a regional hit. And they had, what else did they have? Oh, there's just some rubbish. And they tried to put out lots of sort of Broadway show records, and nothing stuck. And finally, after about a year or two, I don't know, they were just totally in the red. And Jack Warner said, well, get rid of this stupid thing. We don't need it. And just at the last second, they found a guy named Bob Newhart. Bob Newhart got off the bus in Chicago, played a tape of his stuff to Jim Conkling. Conkling arranged, he didn't even have a gig booked. Conkling arranged for a gig. They recorded it. It went supernova. And Warner Brothers was kind of saved. And Alan Sherman was a similar case. And comedy records would sell in those days. And so Warner's kind of got a bit of a break, phone call from the governor. And then in a weird thing, in a movie move where they were trying to get Frank Sinatra's services to act in a movie, they part of the deal to get Frank was that they would buy his record label, which he had started a few years back because he wanted to show them how it was done. And of course, he didn't know how it was done, and he was losing money hand over fist because he signed nothing but his buddies, and like a lot of terrible music, and no rock and roll whatsoever. Absolutely forget it. So as part of this deal, they bought Reprise, Warner Brothers did, and they became Warner Brothers Reprise. And when they picked up Reprise, they picked up a young guy named Mo Austin, who was running Reprise for Sinatra, sometimes to Sinatra's satisfaction, sometimes not. And that was the beginning. That was when they came in, and then Mo kind of convinced Sinatra that maybe let me do a few independent signings, and lo and behold, he signs the Kinks, he signs Jimi Hendrix, he signs a lot of rock and roll, Nancy Sinatra and Lee Hazelwood, and started to have some rock hits, pop hits, because by then Beatles had broken. It was all about the rock and roll. Fast forward to I forget when. Warner Brothers Records, Warner Brothers Reprise Records, is sold to Seven Arts Limited, which is a sort of a movie conglomerate. They briefly become Warner Seven Arts, but really what we're doing is sort of stuffing the stock, making it really valuable. Warner Seven Arts then goes out and buys Atlantic Records, which Atlantic owners sell to Warner 7 for way too little. It's really a bad deal. But they get in there and they realize, hey, we've been kind of fucked ourselves. So they cut new deals, because that conglomerate now is looking for a new buyer. And they find it in the Kinney Corporation. Steve Ross, he arranges to buy Elektra Records, which has been successful as a folk label. And then they got hot with the Doors and Love, the Doors really, and a few other bands. And so you had WEA. And so WEA kind of took off. They created Asylum. Asylum exploded. And they are still today, I can't describe the whole story in this short video, but this book is really great. It goes right up to, well, it's got Flea in it. And it's a coffee table book for sure. You don't get a lot of hard facts about the down and dirty, but it's a great coffee table book. We got that in the thrift store for $5, so I bought it. Okay, next. Well, the next label, the granddaddy label, Columbia. This is a very good, if somewhat dispassionate, account of the Columbia Records slash CBS story. You get all the explanations about why there was a Columbia in England and a Columbia in America, and they didn't have anything to do with each other, except that they originally kind of did, but then they became separate, and then Columbia agreed they wouldn't use Columbia in England, and I can't remember what the deal was with England not doing something in America. At any rate, it's a complicated story. He tells it very well. It's a pretty thick book. This I got this online. It looks like it's an ex-library book. It was pretty cheap. I think it was $10. I'm glad I bought it. But I don't go back to it. It's not, maybe it's not a super entertaining book. I don't know. Okay, another coffee table book. This was a Christmas present, I believe, Becoming Electra. Largely the story of Jack Holzman, who is the founder of Electra. This is very informative, and it's all sort of a coffee table book. So this book is a terrific balance. I love books like this, told from, I would assume, pretty much Jack Holzman's viewpoint. It goes into a lot of detail. Old psychedelic rock freaks are going to just love this shit. And it goes through the purchase to or sale to WIA, and it's a good solid book. 20, $30 US it says here. So if you're really into Electra, it's not a bad book. It's not super expensive. Okay, now this, I remember looking for this. God, this was hard to find. Look at how dirty it is. It's all dusty. The yellow label, as they like to call it. Now, Deutsche Grammophon, as a kid, I came to understand that Deutsche Grammophon classical records were just a notch better than everybody else's. The sound was better, the pressings were better, the performances were pretty much always fantastic, and they did a lot of neat, weird stuff. They did Stockhausen. They were the real bee's knees. This is a book about the yellow label. Again, it's real soft pedal. There is no controversy in here. It comes with 5 CDs of music that anybody who's really into this record probably has already. Oh, 2 CDs. I thought it was 5. But there's all kinds of, like, Schubert, Verdi, Vaughan Williams, Tárrega, Wagner, Chopin. Nothing, there's no Stockhausen, I'm sure. But it's a great book, and again, it more just charts the progression of the artists and the sound, and there's some little pocket bios of all the major figures, which I really liked, because I don't, a lot of them I don't, they're not exactly public figures. There's your avant-garde. Yes, that's my favorite page right there. And it touches on pretty much everything. I just really wanted this when it came out. It was part of the 111th anniversary celebration. Don't ask me why. 111, and it was hard to find, and I think I ended up paying too much for it. But nonetheless, anyway, Deutsche Grammophon has a book about itself, as does Naxos. Okay, now this, I don't remember what I paid for this. I can't believe I paid $40 for it. Naxos, if you don't know, is a label formed by the guy whose name I cannot remember. Where's his name? Klaus Hyman. Klaus Hyman had a great label called Marco Polo. And Marco Polo its repertoire was all really weird. They would use Eastern European orchestras right around when communism was starting to go off the vine. And so they made all kinds. They made things like Havergal Brian's Gothic Symphony, which must have cost a fortune to make even in Czechoslovakia. But he did a lot of cool work, and he also had a bunch of these budget labels, with the names of which escape me. I know I've got some of them, because they got the same font on the spine as Naxos. But and the Marco Polo was really expensive, and I bought a bunch the other day. And generally I'll buy, if it's on Marco Polo, I'll buy it. But they were expensive, so you didn't go buy them in the store. Anyway, he finally coalesced all of this into a label called Naxos, and he basically formulated the idea that they were all going to be budget priced. And they are all pretty much budget priced, and his distribution models were different. They're available in bookstores. Um, at first, they just covered standard repertoire, just filled the standard repertoire with high quality, mostly Eastern European artists performing pretty much the whole book of Schubert, Schumann, Beethoven, Mozart, you name it, everybody. New recordings, they were really cheap to make. And then once he kind of filled the, and he amassed a huge repertoire, and I think they were $7.95 new list. They were cheap. And the covers are kind of quick and nasty. I never liked the graphics. And in fact, I'm a bit of a snob about them. I do buy a lot of Naxos. They've done all kinds of like they did a box of Charles Ives 114 songs, which is, I think they're the only people that ever did that. So they also have done a lot of contemporary music. They've done a lot of I think they've got a Jewish culture series that's really interesting, full of like lots of obscure stuff. I can't diss the guy on his label. This book is really dull. I read it and I went, okay. And then I don't know. I'm surprised I still had it. It is probably the only classical label, to survive the great sort of end of the, you know, buy your music era. And they've managed to survive into the new era. If you go into bookstores, you'll still find they'll usually have a table of Naxos, and it'll usually be a whole bunch of stuff, Eric Satie CDs. I'd love to know their sales figures because I got, they must have sold a lot. Their bottom line must have been very low, and good for them. I mean, I wish I got snobby about them the way I get about Deutsche Grammophon, but no. And that's a pretty big label. So now we're getting into the sort of smaller labels. Okay, this one's great. You find this all over the place. The House That Train Built. Good book about Impulse Records. And Impulse Records really was a label. ABC Paramount, which in those years was a happening label. They wanted to expand. They had just bought Ray Charles's contract, gave him an outrageous contract. He got a contract like nobody had ever got before, and it made him rich. And he did pretty good with ABC. But ABC, they never really made it. James Gang were on ABC. Dunhill hooked up with ABC, and Dunhill really carried the freight. But in about whenever it was, 60, 61, they got the notion to start a jazz label, and they thought they wanted to make it really high class. So they hired a variety of people. I think Creed Taylor was the first one, and then they went through a few different guys. But their whole idea was that they were going to do really cutting edge, high end jazz. They were going to find the artists that would make this label work. They were going to make the covers really glossy, really good to look at. Everything about it was going to be top flight. And they were kind of emulating Atlantic's approach to jazz records, which was kind of similar. Anyways, they snagged John Coltrane as their star artist. And they went on a great run. And Impulse, anybody who buys jazz will tell you that Impulse is good stuff. And some of, like the Coltrane Impulses are, they all belong in the Smithsonian. Impulse kind of went from strength to strength through the 60s. Very inconveniently, John Coltrane died, and that sort of robbed them of their real meal ticket. And but they still did lots of great stuff. They had Ellis Coltrane. They still had. They did Albert Ayler. They did the Albert Ayler story is weird. Ayler was a very strange free jazz saxophonist who was almost primitive and crude, and he kind of, I don't know what happened. I think he might have done some LSD, But he suddenly emerged with his new girlfriend as a kind of a soul combo, really trying hard, it sounded like, to be commercial, except the only problem was that Albert Eiler couldn't be commercial because he was just too fucking weird. So what you have is this great boogie rock with this shattered, insane free saxophone. I find it fascinating. And I can't believe that Impulse didn't say, yeah, great, do it. Maybe we'll have a hit. But they never didn't. Never had a hit with that stuff. Some of it is brutally misbegotten. There's a great record where he does a duet with Henry Vestine of Canned Heat. Now, Liberation Orchestra music on it. This was a very formative record for me because I heard it on FM radio when it came out, January 1970, and I just didn't have a clue what it was. I didn't know what free jazz was or anything. Now, my book is falling apart. Anyway, it's a really great record, pretty weird. Carla Bley. And back when I was 11, that would have been when I was 11, actually still 10, that was really cool. It goes through that era, it goes into the 70s with Esmond Edwards, and it finally it got bought by, when ABC got bought by MCA, it went with it and kind of just disappeared. They brought it back. I think Diana Krall did some stuff. The real headache is in the thrift stores. Because they had distinctive spines, sort of like that, you can spot them in the thrift store a mile away. Now, I'll buy anything on impulse, except for Diana Krall. 99 out of 100 impulse CDs you find in the thrift store with the majestic orange and black spine are Diana Krall CDs. Now, nothing against Mrs. Krall, who I actually quite enjoy, but I don't need anymore. I've got what I want, and yeah. So I'm not hating on Diana Krall, but I run into her a lot in the thrift stores. Okay, so there's Impulse, nice little label. Then there's, I might have reviewed this before, Casablanca. Larry Harris was Neil Bogart's, I think, cousin, and he was one of the main guys, one of the owners, operators of Casablanca Records. This book is a complete hoot. It's written as an insider, because I should have actually saved this for the insider's review, and maybe I will, maybe I'll say it, but it's the inside story of Casablanca, its rise, its fall, its demise, Neil Bogart's renaissance, fall, and then real honest-to-God demise. It's kind of sad, but it's a real hoot, and boy, if you like reading about people doing a lot of cocaine, you're going to love this book, I'll tell you, because it happens a fair bit. This was out of the thrift store. What was this doing there? Rough Trade. Rough Trade was a great indie English, whatever you want to call it, post-rock label, maybe? And they are famous mostly for the Smiths. They're still going. Their latest band that I like is Black Midi. And they were really cool. They were quirky. They were a little bit, I don't want to say lo-fi, but they didn't care if it was lo-fi. They had bands like the Swell Maps, who are pretty lo-fi. This is pretty much what you would expect from such a book. A good overview of the label and its history, some great photos. There's an outtake from the Slits. Good book if you're into Rough Trade. And Rough Trade, especially in the beginning, they did a lot of really different stuff. They had Blood Ulmer, and they had the Pop Group, and they had lots of really Sea and Cake. Great label. Like, pretty much, I mean, if I see anything in a thrift store that's on Rough Trade and I don't know what it is, if it's cheap, I'll just buy it because it's probably pretty good. Not always good, because as they got into Smithland, they started to sign maybe some stiffs. But I mean, Shockabilly was on Rough Trade, so, you know, and I love Shockabilly. There is no mention of Shockabilly in that book whatsoever, but there you go. Shockabilly, probably best left forgotten in the Rough Trade story, but that's another story. Okay, so now Rough Trade, pretty good little indie label, slightly smaller label, SST. Okay, all of you who have your copies of Damaged, this is great. It's a really well-researched book. It doesn't, I mean, Mr. Ginn doesn't come out smelling like a rose, but that's kind of how it is. When the truth kind of hurts. I found this really interesting. It has a complete discography in the back, which is really fascinating. when you realize that, like SST 383, Greg Ginn and the Royal We, Greg Ginn and the Royal We, Greg Ginn and the Royal We. There's a lot of Greg Ginn releases here. So, I mean, it's his label. But at any rate, very good. If you're interested in punk rock and the history of independent records in the punk rock scene, this is a must-read. Well worth reading. Getting into weird stuff. Okay, now we're getting into some strange stuff. This was, I think, in the thrift store. And this $40 new, it says here. This is the story of Smithsonian Folkways. Now, rather wisely, they've included the word folkways because when Moses Osh, who was the guy that started Folkways, when he died, his will stated that he wanted, the word here is Smithsonian, not Folkways. He left his entire archive, everything, to the Smithsonian on the condition that they keep it all in print. Because one of his things was everything was technically always in print. And they managed to do this through the expedient of CDRs. So they were able to honor this request. And they continued Folkways as Smithsonian Folkways. And some of the more popular titles they put out on CD. And I found a lot of these in the thrift store. I'll buy every one of them. I found music from Uruguay. I found all kinds of Pete Seeger records. And they even branched out into some new stuff, new folk music, which is of slightly more dubious interest to me. However, this book is all about the story of Smithsonian. It's terrific. It's covers, Woody Guthrie. I mean, there's a lot of really seminal American musicians in this book. And Moses Ash's way of doing business was really old school. But he really had his heart. His heart was in the right place, and he did what he could do while eking out a living to promote the music that he thought was really important. And there's chapters on the cover art, which was very distinctive. There was little sub-chapters about things like the catalog, the sounds of the office, the science of sound. There was a lot of different stuff on Folkways. Folkways did not only folk music, they were amongst the very first recording of world music, jazz labels. They never did any rock and roll, or at least nothing I would consider to be rock and roll. They really hit their stride in maybe the 50s, 60s. Lead Belly, Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie. We're talking about really important American music figures here. They had free reign. They could do whatever they wanted in the records. Moses never got involved in telling them what to play or anything. They did some John Cage, which is not mentioned in here at all. They did a lot of avant-garde music, and Folkways continues to this day. And new record connectors, young people, are discovering them and discovering what it's a really cool, totally DIY record. It was so DIY. The covers were like these cardboard covers with a cover on one side that came about halfway around the other side, and then you'd open it up and there'd be a thing down the middle. There'd be one side for the booklet, one side for the record, no inner sleeve. Fuck off, $3.98, and they'd make $500. So fabulous label, really interesting book, great. Finally, this one I had to buy. It's not as good as I wanted it to be, but whatever. Oh, and it's really dirty. The Zapple Diaries. Yes, when I was a child. Here's a great story for you. In about 69, I was at the Rexall Drugs in downtown Victoria on 4th Street, which of course is no longer there. And in the middle, and it wasn't a very big drugstore, it was sort of a little downtown kind of drugstore. And right in smack in the middle of the store, there was a little rack, and it had about, 50 records in it. They all had holes punched in them, and they were all 59 cents. And I was maybe, I was with my grandmother, so I must have been pretty young, 9 or 10. And but I was into records, and I was into rock records. I knew my records. And so I started digging through this, and it was all Pickwick shit, just garbage. And but then I discovered a Bob Seger System record with the blue cover with the woman on the cover. 59, even I could afford 59 cents when I was a kid. So I went, oh, that's interesting. You know, in retrospect, I think, oh, it was all Capitol stuff because Pickwick was Capitol, and it was probably some Capitol remainders. Anyway, wouldn't you know it, but I come across a record that I wasn't familiar with, but I recognized John Lennon on the cover, and his girlfriend was on the cover. Then I flip it over, and it's on a label called Zapple. And I'm like, and it's a John Lennon record? I'd never heard of it. How come I haven't heard this on the radio? He asked, not knowing how the answer would go. So I was delighted. I bought both of them because I had them over, I had $2 on me, I think. Go home and yes, and I played the, I played the, strangely, I don't know why, because I was a huge Beatles fan. I played the Bob Seger record first, and it's a great psychedelic, really good Bob Seger record. You got to try it out. If you think Seger is no good at all, that's a good place to go. And I thought, wow, cool. It was quite prog rock almost. Then I thought, okay, great. I gear up for this John Lennon record. And the first track on the first side, and it's the only track on the first side, is Cambridge 1969, which is, to put it very short, Yoko screaming, and I mean just Yoko screaming, free, doing her free form voice, and John basically playing feedback guitar. And they do this for a lot like 20 minutes. And then John Chahai, well known American saxist playing, I think then in Copenhagen, and John Stevens, who shows up in the weirdest places on drums, they join the fray and they play it out until I do believe it just fades out. And my 9-year-old brain did not quite understand this record. And so I turned it over, whereupon you get 4 little art pieces. One is John flipping between radio stations. One is 5 minutes of the baby's heartbeat that they ultimately lost. One is 2 minutes of silence to commemorate the death of said baby. And then there's about 12 minutes of, 12 minutes of John flipping through a radio station. The earlier thing is just Yoko chanting a poem. Anyway, I did not understand this record, and nor did a lot of people. And so I sort of filed it and forgot about it, and ultimately came to realize that these had something to do with art. And there was a George Harrison record on the Zapple label as well. And I knew better than to spend real money on it, so I didn't. And then years later, and I still have a copy of it, I bought it, and it was like somebody learning how to use a Moog synthesizer. But I thought, Zapple, what the heck? Anyway, this tells you the story of Zapple. It's an interesting, pretty cool story. Great, it shows you what happens when people with way too much money get the idea to do something that they just don't have a fucking clue about what they're doing. Sadly, it was going to be lots of poetry records and stuff. And, like Florence Ferlinghetti, I think, was supposed to be on them. And so I think these even got recorded. Charles Bukowski, I think, maybe was one. But they never happened. Alan Klein came in and went, what the fuck? What is all this? We're hemorrhaging money. What's this Zapple crap? Yeah! And that was it for Zapple. Goodbye. Yeah, electronic sound. And so it was just for that hot minute in the, whatever it was, 68? The Beatles expressing themselves without regard to checkbook or anything. We're going to make a store and call it the Apple Boutique, and we're going to have a label called Zapple. We're going to put out records for £1, or then we're going to put them up for the price of a single. And all this sort of stuff that wasn't really kind of, not really very business-like and logical. The great postscript to my story about my copy of Life with the Lions was, I went to school with a guy who was in the Navy Cadets, and he played the bass clarinet, but he was a bit of a hard nut, and he lived with his dad just over from my place, and his dad was a German gentleman who used to really dig having polka parties in his basement, and he had a stereo, one of those cabinet stereos in the basement with a changer, and they'd load the changer up with endless polka records, and he'd have all his buddies over and girlfriends and whatnot, and they'd all drink themselves. So it was Oktoberfest every weekend at my buddy's place. And sometimes we'd sit upstairs and smoke hash and listen to them losing their minds. And we'd play records upstairs. It was the one time his dad wasn't on his ass all the time. Because his dad was kind of an abusive father, perhaps you could say. And at any rate, we were there one night, and this wasn't super long after I'd bought the John Lennon record, maybe a couple of months. I kind of had dismissed it as, artsy fartsy garbage, which a lot of people insist that it is. I've actually listened to Cambridge 1969 through a few times, and I kind of get what they were trying to do, but, I don't listen to it often. At any rate, we were upstairs smoking hash, being pranksters, and it was just before party time, and he had expressed an interest in hearing what this record sounded like. So I took it over to his place, and he's like, "Holy fuck, this is just awful! What the hell?" So he goes, "Hey, we should stick this in the stack of polka records, right in the middle." And we thought that's a great idea. So we did. He snuck downstairs when Dad wasn't looking, slid the record in, put it back on the changer. He held like 6 or 8 records, and we went out and did some stuff because party time wasn't until later. We came back. Party's in full swing. We don't really know where we are in the program, but we sat upstairs and we got kind of paralytically stoned on hashish while the oompa got louder and louder and the talking got louder and people started getting drunk and there was a lot of loud laughter. And this went on for what seemed like a long time. Maybe we were just really high. And suddenly there was sort of a long silence, which in retrospect I realize is Yoko's spoken intro, which does go on for 25 seconds or so, and then she just proceeds to start screaming, which is solo for 15 seconds or so, and then John joins with a blast of feedback. Anyways, we're upstairs, and we hear the Yoko scream, and then we hear the guitar come in, and then the whole thing just is unleashed, and it goes for, it seemed like several lifetimes, but I would think they probably played better part of a minute of this piece before there was silence. The party is stone dead. After a brief pause, the oompa starts again. People start talking again. It sort of starts to get back to life. We're upstairs like, wow, that was wild. And there's a knock at the door, and there's his dad. And his dad comes in, and he's got the record in 2 pieces. He goes, "I think you left your record in the stereo." And he just threw the pieces of the record in and closed the door and went back to his party. Anyway, yeah, my copy of Life with the Lions, I have it on CD now. Just anyway, thanks for watching. This is only sort of part 1. I got a whole another bunch I'm going to do later of similar but different books of insiders from insiders that were in the business itself. So I'll do that one next, and we'll put that out as and when. Take care of each other, and R.I.P. to my friend Robin, 15 years together at Logan's. Passed away way too young, and we're all pretty blue. So hug your friends, and we'll talk to you soon.